Let's have another informative and interesting historical video covering events of February 1946. On February 1, Trygve Lie was sworn in as the first Secretary-General of the United Nations. Syria and the Soviet Union secretly signed a treaty for military advisors to come to Syria. A treaty between the USSR and Lebanon was signed 2 days later. Zoltán Tildy was sworn into office as the first president of Hungary, and Ferenc Nagy succeeded Tildy as prime minister. Both were forced out by the Communist Party within 2 years. On February 2, the Soviet Union formally annexed the Japanese Kuril Islands. 2 unusually large sunspots disrupted radio communication between North America and Europe between 4:05 a.m. and 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A fire in a retirement home in Garfield Heights, Ohio, killed 33 people. On February 3, RDT, NBC radio commentator Drew Pearson broke the news of what would become known as the Guzenko Affair. A Soviet spy ring had been operating in Canada, and that the spy agency GRU had been transmitting American atomic secrets from Ottawa to Moscow. Friedrich Jeckeln, SS commander during the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union, was hanged in public at Pobeda Square in Riga, along with 5 of his officers. Jeckeln oversaw the deaths of more than 250,000 people, mostly Jewish, during the Second World War. On February 4, national weather forecasts returned to American newspapers after 4 years. Publication of maps had ceased on December 15, 1941, a week after the United States entered World War II. On February 5, the first scheduled transatlantic commercial airplane flight was made when the Star of Paris, a TWA constellation, took off at 2:21 p.m. from New York's LaGuardia Airport. The plane landed in Paris 14 hours and 48 minutes later. Plaza Mexico, the world's largest bullring, was opened in Mexico City. The Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge was established in Oklahoma by order of President Truman. On February 6, Charles Viner Brooke, the White Rajah of the state of Sarawak, ceded the state's sovereignty to the United Kingdom as a British Crown colony. Sarawak is now part of Malaysia. Cession came to pass on July 1. On February 7, in its colony in Vietnam, the military forces of France made a large-scale assault to recapture the Ben Tre province, which had been under control of the Viet Minh since August 25, 1945. The province was quickly brought back under French rule, but guerrilla activity continued. On February 8, Kim Il-sung was elected chairman of the Interim People's Committee in the Soviet-occupied portion of Korea. Kim, who led the northern branch of the Korean Communist Party, would become the first leader of North Korea. On February 9, in what has been described as the beginning of the Cold War, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin addressed a national radio audience in his first major public speech after the end of World War II. Stalin said that another war was inevitable because of the capitalist development of the world economy, and that the USSR would need to concentrate on national defense in advance of a war with the Western nations. On February 10, in the first election in the Soviet Union since 1937, there was a reported turnout of 101,450,936 voters, 99.7% of those eligible. For the 682 deputies of the Soviet of the Union, and the 657 members of the Soviet of Nationalities, the candidates were unopposed and the choice was yes or no. Of the 1,339 candidates, there were 254 who were not Communist Party members. Hubertus van Mook, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, proposed a plan for Indonesia's people to choose independence or Dutch citizenship as part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. On February 12, Trans-Australia Airlines made its first flight. In advance of the presidential election in Argentina, the U.S. State Department issued a 121-page Blue Book, with evidence that Argentina, and candidate Juan Perón, had aided Nazi Germany during World War II. Perón won the election in spite of the American publication. On February 14, the Bank of England was nationalised, with the signing of a 250-page bill by King George VI. The U.S. Army introduced ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, to the public in a press conference at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. The world's first electronic computer weighed 30 tons, had 18,000 vacuum tubes. On February 15, 22 current and former Canadian government employees were arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, after Soviet defector Igor Guzenko had provided a list of 1,700 North American informants who were providing classified information to the USSR. The United Steel Workers of America and the United States Steel Corporation brought an end to the strike that had begun on January 21, with 130,000 employees returning to work on February 18 in return for an 18% per hour wage increase. On February 16, the first UN Security Council veto was made, as the Soviet Union killed a resolution concerning the withdrawal of British and French forces from Syria and Lebanon. On February 17, in a policy of preventing Jewish immigration to Palestine, British authorities intercepted the ship Enzo Sereni, with 915 refugees on board. The Zionist group Palmach retaliated 3 days later with the destruction of a British Coast Guard station. Ismail Sidki became the new Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Egypt, succeeding Mahmoud el-Nokrashi Pasha. Nokrashi would return in December. On February 18, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny began at 8 a.m. at the port of Colaba near Bombay. In the first mutiny in British India since 1857, a group of 1,600 sailors from HMIS Talwar walked out of the mess hall because of inadequate food, and began to chant, "No food, no work." The next day, another 20,000 ratings in Bombay joined the strike, and over the next days, rioting broke out. Before order was restored on February 24, there were 223 deaths and 1,037 injuries. On February 19, the cabinet mission to India was announced in the British House of Commons by Lord Pethick Lawrence, the Secretary of State for India. The cabinet mission would depart on March 15 in order to meet with representatives on the eventual independence of British India. On February 20, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced plans to effect the transference of power to responsible India hands by a date not later than June 1948. The Allied Powers government in Japan ended the 3-century-old tradition of kosho, licensed prostitution. On February 21, uprisings against colonial rule took place across Asia, with disturbances in Egypt, India, Singapore and Indonesia. On February 22, the long telegram was sent from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to the U.S. Department of State and would become the basis of American foreign policy for nearly 50 years. At more than 8,000 words, it was the longest telegraphed message sent to that time. On February 23, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who led the Japanese conquest of Singapore and the Philippines, was executed by hanging in Manila for war crimes, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Seiichi Oda, who had headed security for Japan's Thought Police, and interpreter Takuma Higashigi. On February 28, Ho Chi Minh, the newly elected president of Vietnam, sent a telegram to U.S. President Harry S. Truman, asking that the United States use its influence to persuade France not to send occupation forces back into Vietnam, and to interfere urgently in support of our independence. Truman's reply was that the U.S. would support France, and Ho sought assistance from the Soviet Union instead. Former Prime Minister of Hungary, Bela Imreti, was executed by firing squad for collaboration with the Nazis.